people coming to this first African Initiative event after the spring break. I don't have to give the spiel to those who were here, but those who are online. The African Initiative, as you know, is the basic front for intellectual work, scholarly work, research on Africa. African Initiative, its purpose is to focus on Africa as an important site of knowledge by highlighting teaching, research, publication by Syracuse University scholars in the arts, humanities, social and natural sciences. Now, this initiative has been around for more than 20 years, and we have symposium, conferences. We haven't had many conferences because of the pandemic, but we are trying to have more in-person work, and we highlight work on global Africa. And so today, we are highlighting one of the budding and up-and-coming scholars from Syracuse University, from the Department of History, Professor Tessa Murphy. African Initiative, and I, as the Director of African Initiative, I'm very pleased to welcome you as a fellow Torontonian, someone who went to the University of Toronto, and after University of Toronto, she went to the University of Chicago, and she did her doctoral work in the University of Chicago. Now, in communicating Mahi, she was very modest. She gave a 4-line bio of what she did. But she is not only a distinguished scholar. Her book that she's going to address today, The Creole Archipelago, Race and Borders in the Colonial Caribbean. Now, from Kalinagos to Black Caribs. Those of you who've read the book by Hilary Beckles, how many remember that book? So you know about the Kalinagos, but a lot of people do not know about the Kalinagos. And in her research, she's been to the Caribbean, Dominica, St. Lucia, Martinique. Today, she's going to share with us her research, and she's a historian of the early Americas of the 17th century, particularly focused on race and colonization in the colonial Caribbean. Please join me in welcoming Tessa to our African Initiative.
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for being here today, whether in person or online. As was mentioned, I'm Tessa Murphy. I'm an assistant professor in the history department here at SU. And my talk today is informed by my recent book, The Creole Archipelago, Race and Borders in the Colonial Caribbean, about which I'm happy to answer any questions about this, kind of talk colonial Caribbean in general. But at the invitation of the African Initiative, it was suggested that I focus on a particular aspect of my research, specifically the historical process by which an indigenous polity, the Kalinagos of the Lesser Antilles, became an Afro-Indigenous people, often known by the name of Black Caribs, and how settlers and British colonial officials in the Caribbean island of Saint Vincent seized on that hybrid identity to emphasize that Black Caribs were first and foremost Black, or Afro-descended, and therefore not entitled to the land on which many of their ancestors had lived for generations. So we'll start with an episode that comes at the very end of the book, by focusing on a site of Afro-Indigenous exile whose history, even in the present day, is being erased. So just to get us situated here, we're in the Caribbean and we're looking at the Lesser Antilles, so the smaller islands to the southern end here. And we're zooming in on the island of Belliso, which is a Grenadine island just south of Saint Vincent, north of Grenada, which is just off the map here, and about 1.5 miles south of another Grenadine island called Batalia. And as you can see in this image, Belliso is a pretty rocky island. It's surrounded by reefs, and it only measures, you can't tell from the photo, but it only measures about 320 square acres. The island has actually been for sale for a number of years now. This is one of those price available upon request situations, but some internet sleuthing suggests it's going for about $29 to $30 million. And in the ad here, the sellers note the long and interesting history of what they call the Cinderella of the Grenadines, particularly its role as a lookout for soldiers during the so-called Caravors, which, depending on which part of the paragraph you read, happened between 1769 and 1795, or 1772 to 1797. So this is a good reason for real estate companies to hire historians, proofreaders, etc. Right? What the ad doesn't mention, though, is that in 1796 and 1797, these soldiers were also keeping watch over several thousand people who were relocated to Belliso at the end of these so-called Carib Wars. As we see in this document from the British National Archives, between July 1796 and February 1797, some 4,776 children, women, and men landed at Belliso. And this document really dispassionately notes their arrival from 65 men, 89 women, and 122 children who disembarked in July 1796, to a single child who arrived alone in February 1797. Belliso is, as we saw in the previous picture, relatively small. It doesn't have much in the way of natural resources or infrastructure, and although the real estate ad fails to mention this, it actually doesn't have a source of fresh water. Although these supplies were supposed to be brought to the island at the expense of the British colonial government that was exiling these people, it seems likely that conditions on the island during this period of exile were less than ideal. And whatever the exact cause, as almost 5,000 people crowded onto this 320 square acre rock, many began to die. A report on the, quote, malignant pestilential disease that took hold amongst the exiles, that was authored by an assistant surgeon named Nicholas Dickinson, who was actually charged with caring for the sick, blamed the illness on, quote, the impolite obstinacy of the Caribs themselves in not making an earlier submission. Dr. Dickinson further noted that, quote, its subsequent dreadful consequences are in great measure to be attributed to the Caribs' own inhumanity. So with a doctor like that, it's perhaps unsurprising that the exiles did not fare very well. Beginning in September and peaking in December of 1796, hundreds of exiles died each month at Belliso, including almost 1,000 people in the month of December alone. So you can compare the fatalities among the so-called Caribs to those of the British troops who were charged with guarding them during this exile. By the time that a fleet of 10 British warships arrived to transport the survivors to the island of Roatan, which is an island off the coast of a colony that was called British Honduras, but is present-day Belize. This was in the winter, or in March 1797. Just half of those who had been exiled from Saint Vincent remained alive. You can see from this map just how far the site of exile is. So Saint Vincent doesn't actually appear on the map, it's too far east. So it's at least 1,000 miles to the west of the site of this exile. From here, The exiles' descendants, who became known as the Garifuna people, spread out to the Caribbean coasts of Belize, Guatemala, and Honduras, where their descendants remain known as a recognized minority population in Central America and the present day the Garifuna people. Belliso, although little talked about, remains a graveyard to more than 2,000 people recognized by the Garifuna as ancestors. And today, their descendants are engaged in an attempt to have the island recognized as a heritage site. They would like the Vincentian government to buy Belliso. So my talk is interested in kind of tracing how this dispossession happened, and also why it remains relatively little known beyond the Garifuna and Vincentian communities. One of the things that my book traces are the processes and products of racialization in the colonial Caribbean. Throughout the book, I interrogate how and why different individuals and groups of people were seen and treated by those in power at various moments in the 17th and 18th century. These include people of Afro-European ancestry, who I'm very happy to talk about in the Q&A, but it also includes people of Indigenous American and Afro-Indigenous descent. I argue that over the course of the 18th century, and particularly after the formerly Indigenous territories of Saint Vincent and Dominica became British colonies as a result of the 1763 Treaty of Paris, imperial officials deliberately began to recast and to call into question the origins of people who asserted that they were indigenous to the Caribbean. And this process of racialization in turn facilitated dispossession, as thousands of so-called Black Caribs were removed from lands that were then transformed into sugar plantations worked by enslaved Africans and their Caribbean-born descendants. Now, these links between Indigenous dispossession and the rise of plantation societies are becoming more clear to scholars of mainland North America. These are a couple of quite recent books where that relationship is not the focal point, but it's certainly acknowledged. But in the Caribbean, this process, the rhetorical and also subsequently the very real act of alienating Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous peoples from their lands in order to transform those lands into sites of Black slavery remains unexplored and often unacknowledged. And part of this relates to the presumed absence of Indigenous people from much of the Caribbean by the time of European settlement. Until fairly recently, historians accepted narratives born of the Black legend that may be familiar to you. It's an account of Spanish cruelty and destruction that was popularized by a missionary named Bartolome de las Casas in his published volume, A Brief Narrative of the Destruction of the Indies. And here we see a Spanish version that was published in 1552. With his very vivid descriptions of Spanish cruelties in the island of Hispaniola, many of which were later illustrated in the form of the drawings that you see here, these were interspersed throughout the text. Las Casas helped spread the idea that Indigenous people were killed in warfare, were mutilated, were hunted by dogs, or were simply murdered by Spanish conquistadors. And I realize that these images are quite shocking and they're difficult to look at, but I think they're important to include both because written documents from that time corroborate that this was happening. So things like Spaniards cutting off the hands of Indigenous people for not bringing up tribute from the gold mines. We have documents that tell us that those things occurred. But also because these images heavily influenced European readers at the time, and I argue also influenced historians in the centuries since. This image is one of those that accompanied Las Casas' account, showing again Spaniards inflicting mass death on the Indigenous peoples of Hispaniola. And in the background, we can just barely make out some Indigenous people fleeing from these cruelties. But the overall sense is that this is a genocidal event. This is an extinction event. And certainly, Indigenous depopulation in Hispaniola, which is present-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, was significant. 16th century Spanish colonial documents show a rapid decline in the island's indigenous population. But Hispaniola, as we can see from this map, is just one island within a much broader Caribbean. And what happened there should not, I argue, be assumed to have happened everywhere in the Caribbean. Instead, I want to interrogate the processes of erasure that led to these widespread assumptions of indigenous absence and African replacement or displacement. I argue that indigenous technologies were key not only to survival, but to forging a shared space across islands not successfully colonized by Europeans until almost 250 years after Columbus's arrival in Hispaniola. Canoa, which if that word sounds familiar to you, that's an indigenous Kalinago word for canoe. This indigenous technology allowed people to move between islands both before and long after European arrival. And here we see some areas of migration and exchange, people coming from the Orinoco River Basin in South America to both the Greater and Lesser Antilles, and also people from Central America going as far east as Puerto Rico. As I show in my book, indigenous people and those who adopted their technologies used canoa to access places that European sailing ships couldn't reach, such as shallow waters, rocky coastlines, and the windward side of islands where strong winds would push sailing ships away, but where people who were rowing boats could beat against that wind and access those shores. And here we see a canoa being built in the present day using traditional techniques, which involve using fire to hollow out the center of a single, usually copperwood tree. And so depending on the size of the tree, canoa can carry as many as 50 or 60 people. These can be very impressive vessels. As I show in the first chapter of my book, indigenous presence and indigenous power are frequently acknowledged in early colonial sources for the Lesser Antilles. So this mid-17th century map of the French colony of Martinique, which is held at the John Carter Brown Library at Brown University, shows that the island was divided into the Denille Français, so the place where the French lived, and the Denille Sauvage, the place where wild or savage people lived. Zooming in, we can see that the map maker had some knowledge of indigenous political organization. They've noted the Calvé as the place where the Caribs make their assemblies, suggesting that this is an important gathering place for indigenous people on the eastern or windward coast of the island. In a map published several decades later, though, the Calvé, or the place where the Kalinagos make their assembly, has become Cul-de-sac Français, or François, so a French place, or possibly named after a French man named François. This map, which dates to the mid-18th century, allows us to trace French colonization of the Kalinagos side of Martinique. So just north of Cul-de-sac François, you see Batterie à Massacre, massacre fort, alluding to an ardent confrontation between Kalinagos and French forces documented in written accounts from the era. And we also see the first windmill in the island, which the map here notes was built in 1718. And several other windmills dot the side of the island formerly known as the dwelling place of Kalinagos. So that's a windmill. This little thing is also a windmill. Windmills were used to grind sugar cane. So these seemingly innocuous structures actually speak to the advance of sugar production in early 18th century Martinique. This in turn speaks to the growth of an enslaved African and Afro-descended population. Indeed, by the middle decades of the 18th century, more than 50,000 West African people had been trafficked directly to this French colony. So instead, again, we have this seeming absence. There's no more dwelling place of the Kalinagos, but instead of assuming and kind of accepting an absence here, we can read this map for processes of displacement, replacement, and erasure. Contrary to what this map may suggest, as I show in my book, Kalinagos did not simply disappear. And instead, this map, which focuses on the French colony of Martinique and then St. Lucia down to the south, you've got Dominica and Saint Vincent just appearing at the edges here to kind of suggest the closeness between these islands. They suggest where people who left colonial spaces went. As countless parish records that are held in the Archive départementale de la Martinique and also in France's Archive nationale du Colonial, which is in Aix-en-Provence in France, attest, people who migrated outside the sphere of French rule would use Kanaloa to come back within that sphere of rule in order to take part in important Catholic rites like baptism and marriage and burial. And so in this record, which is from 1722, we see that a nègre or free Black man, demeurant à Saint-Lucie, so living in St. Lucia, and an unnamed Carabias or Carib woman have brought their son to be baptized from St. Lucia to Martinique. Such families, I argue, are really not uncommon in this interconnected space that I call the Creole archipelago. As this map of the 17th and 18th century Lesser Antilles shows, French and English colonies like Martinique and Guadeloupe, represented in blue, and English colonies like Barbados, represented in red, were interspersed with islands that had been recognized as indigenous territories by a 1660 treaty that was signed by English, French, and Kalinago representatives. The 1660 treaty, which I discuss in my book and in a related publication, stipulated that, quote, the said islands of Saint Vincent and Dominica will forever belong to the said savages, meaning Kalinagos. They cannot be settled by one or the other of the said English and French nations. These are explicitly recognized as indigenous spaces within a Caribbean for which colonial powers are really competing. As the years wore on, these Kalinago islands were increasingly referred to by English and French officials as neutral. But this neutrality belied growing populations of French settlers, free and enslaved people of African descent, and people of mixed race, who increasingly encroached on Kalinago lands. For the first half of the 18th century, these groups shared space in the islands, much as they had done in Martinique a century earlier. And we see that reflected in documents like the baptismal record, where a Black man and an indigenous woman had formed a relationship, had a child, had families, and lived alongside a quite mixed community in this purportedly neutral space. But this all changed after the 7 Years' War, which was fought from 1756 to 1763. So by virtue of the 1763 Treaty of Paris, Dominica, Saint Vincent, and Grenada, as well as Tobago, became English colonies, while Saint Lucia became a colony of France. A recent book called The New Map of Empire by Max Nagelson shows that British planters and officials approached these islands as key sites for the creation of sugar plantations, kind of laboratories of empire. While the soil in older colonies like Barbados was becoming exhausted by overproduction, colonial officials envisioned these islands in the Lesser Antilles, these new colonies or ceded islands, as virgin lands, ignoring the fact that actually they were populated by white and free Black settlers, as well as enslaved people and indigenous people. To the British, the islands were either empty or were not being put to their proper use, which was to produce sugar to enrich British planters and merchants. This is how they were envisioned. This vision of British prosperity at the expense of African exploitation is reflected in this map of Saint Vincent. This particular copy is held at the John Carter Brown Library, But the map owners, like, it was published in England and then was widely made available for purchase. So both the lands and the map could be kind of held by British subjects. And reading this map as a primary document reveals British approaches to settlement and development. Plots of land could be purchased by individuals, and their names would actually be available in kind of a published guide that accompanied the map. So if you, as an absentee planter, had purchased land in the Caribbean, you could show that little plot, you know, a plot like this, on the map and show your name in the accompanying guide. But the map also reveals just how contested this transformation from Kalinago, or neutral island, into plantation colony really was. So on the northeast side of the island, which is not coincidentally the same windward side that had formerly been recognized as Indigenous Technology in Martinique, and which is still in the island of Dominica, a site of the only indigenous reservation in the Caribbean in the present day, we can see the Carib boundary lines. This might be hard for you, some of you here, to see, but they trace along this way. So these lines divide settler lands, which are carved up into private plots, from indigenous lands, which don't suggest evidence of individual ownership. And we can also see that some of this land was allegedly granted to the Caribs by the late treaty of 1773. What we can learn then is that a new peace had only recently been reached between the British and the Caribs. And indeed, the map speaks to this history. As British surveyors tried to map lands on Saint Vincent's windward eastern side in the late 1760s, they encountered increasing resistance from the island's indigenous and Afro-Indigenous inhabitants. And this resistance came to a head in 1772 and 1773, when British troops were dispatched to Saint Vincent to fight a conflict that became known as the Caravor, and later the First Caravor, which means there was probably a second Caravor, right? So this medal, which was given to British participants in the war, gives us some insight into how this armed conflict was viewed in Great Britain. Those who served did so in the name of King George III, who had recently extended his reach over this island and, of course, over many other parts of the globe in the wake of the 7 Years' War. The battle, according to the medal, was waged for the peace and prosperity of Saint Vincent's. But that prosperity, as the medal suggests, is the birthright of the island's newest arrivals, Scottish and English settlers, whose plantations infringed on Kalinago territories, prompting the conflict in the first place. One of the most important elements of this medal is its depiction of the combatants. The figure of Britannia, represented by this woman here with St. George's cross on her shield in the background, extends an olive branch to a man who has laid down his arms in the name of peace and prosperity. The man is clad in a loincloth and he's barefoot, indicating both his poverty and his more natural or wild state. And importantly, his hair appears tightly coiled, rather than the long, flowing hair often used in depictions of Indigenous Americans. This style suggests the subject's African ancestry. By the time of the Caravor in 1772, depictions of Kalinagos as Afro-Indigenous were quite commonplace. And certainly these depictions are rooted in historic and demographic realities. In the decade after the Treaty of Paris in 1763, British slavers trafficked more than 10,000 people from West Africa just to the island of Saint Vincent. And Saint Vincent is about 200 square miles. It's a small place. As you can see from this graph, trafficking increased substantially in the early 1770s, coinciding with this conflict. And so what we can learn here is that some recently trafficked people escaped to the mountainous regions that had long been home to Kalinagos and Maroons, joining forces with the people already living there. But these depictions, like we saw on the medal, are also rooted in the perception, which was explicitly popularized by settlers and colonial officials in Saint Vincent. The Kalinagos were not real indigenous people, that the fact that many were Afro-Indigenous canceled out their indigeneity and rendered them kind of illegitimate possessors of the land on which their ancestors had lived. Sir William Young, a very wealthy British planter who also had the job of surveying and settling the lands in these new colonies, was very quick to claim that St. Vincent's indigenous inhabitants were, in fact, entirely descended from Africans. In this portrait of Young and his family, their estate in England, we can see his wealth, right? Everyone's dressed really ostentatiously. And we can also get some sense that this wealth was produced in part through slavery. Over here in the background, we see a very well-dressed page looking after one of Young's children. So even in England, slavery is part of Young's everyday life. In his 1764 pamphlet, Considerations which may tend to promote the settlement of our new West India colonies by encouraging individuals to embark in the undertaking, not too short of a title, Young provided an origin story for St. Vincent's existing inhabitants. And in 1764, he acknowledges their Afro-Indigenous origins, but he remains optimistic about the prospect of settlement, of sharing space with people, he refers to as free people. So I've got a very lengthy quote here, but I think it's worth, taking it. In 1764, Young, whose job it is to allocate all of these lands in the new colony, says, the eastern part of St. Vincent is inhabited by about 2,000 natives who owe their origin to a ship freighted with people from Africa to Barbados and wrecked on these coasts. We should talk more about this later, right? The specific route that is given. Their forefathers, amidst the general distress, escaped to shore and found in a desert island a release from their bondage. Thus, from apparent evils do sometimes flow the greatest blessings. Recovered from their fears and refreshed with such sustenance as could be found, it is natural to suppose that they soon solaced themselves with their female friends in the part, and as a state of nature is no enemy to propagation, they of course gave birth to a free people. It is said they found in the woods a few native Caribs whom they have gradually extirpated or reduced to their obedience. They have been usually represented as turbulent and dangerous, but experience now convinces us that they are quiet and well-disposed people, speaking French and instructed by Roman Catholic missionaries in the principles of their, the French Catholic religion. Probably when they are duly apprised of the humanity and generosity of our gracious British sovereign, and assured of the enjoyment of their lands, freedom, favor, and protection, they may be gained over to our cause and even rendered useful. 30 years later, following the first Caravor and on the heel, basically at the beginning of the second Caravor, British outlook on the people, they no longer called Carib, but always and consistently Black Carib, had changed quite a bit. So in a 1795 book, published by William Young's son, William Young Jr., Young Jr. advanced the very specific claim that, quote, the Black Caribs, as they have been termed in recent years, right, this moniker is an invention of people in the 1770s and 80s, are the descendants from the cargo of an African slave ship bound from the Benin to Barbados and wrecked about the year 1675 on the Costa Vecchia, a Grenadine island, which is about 2 leagues south of Saint Vincent. It's actually not far from Belliso. These survivors not only assumed the national appellation of Caribs, but individually their Indian names. And they adopted many of their customs. They flattened the foreheads of their infant children in the Indian manner. This is something that many contemporary commenters talk about. So in infancy, before the skull is like hard and fully formed, Indigenous people in the pre-contact and continuing long after in the Caribbean would attach a board to their children's heads so that it would be flat. They buried their dead in the attitude of sitting, and according to Indian rites, and killing the men they took in war, they carried off and cohabited with the women. These are all behaviors documented by archaeological evidence of Indigenous remains and Indigenous settlements from the pre-contact era, as well as written accounts from the early contact era. I argue that what we're reading here is an account of ethnogenesis, defined as probably familiar with coming into being, the genesis of a new people or ethnos. Living alongside one another for generations, people of African and Indigenous American ancestry gradually developed shared social, cultural, and linguistic practices, giving rise to Afro-Indigenous people. But to Young and to many others who wanted Kalinago land, this was not ethnogenesis, but usurpation. Since Kalinago lands had already been taken over by people who Young claimed were rightfully bound for slavery in Barbados, the so-called Black Caribs who lived in Saint Vincent had no right to this land. Instead, according to Young, it rightfully belonged to King George III and his loyal subjects who were, of course, neither Black nor Indigenous, but white British subjects. This late 18th century racialization of Kalinagos as Black Caribs also extended to the realm of the visual. In the art of Augustino Brutus, who was an Italian painter who actually went to the Lesser Antilles at the invitation of William Young, St. Vincent's Kalinago people are consistently styled as Black Caribs. In this image, Chatoyer, the chief of the Black Caribs in St. Vincent with his 5 wives, we see the leader, who was famed for his participation in the first Caravor, smoking a pipe as he watches several women carry heavy loads. Like the figure in the British medal for the participation in the first Caravor, Chatoyer is barefoot and he's clad only in a loincloth. Rather than appearing in a submissive pose to Britannia, however, Chatoyer is depicted as really lording it over these women. And here too, we see echoes of the rhetorical transformation of Kalinagos from quiet and well-disposed people to violent usurpers. Condemning the polygynous behavior of St. Vincent's inhabitants, Young wrote that, quote, "The Carib women who, laden like beasts of burden, were driven with the flat of a broadsword by Kalinago men from the Carib boundary 15 miles to the English market. No slavery," Young Jr. writes, "is equally wretched with that of the Carib women." And here it should be noted that the Young family laid claim to 300 enslaved people who worked their plantations in Saint Vincent, Antigua, and Tobago. But being Carib apparently is the greater sin. The late 18th century racialization of Kalinagos as Black Caribs, another Brutus piece further suggests how British colonists, officials, and observers rhetorically transformed Kalinagos into Black Caribs, displacing any Indigenous identity in favor of emphasizing the Blackness of this hybrid people in the latter half of the 18th century. This engraving appears in Brian Edwards' 1801 History of the West Indies under the title Pacification of the Maroons. And Edwards used it in his discussion of the Maroon Wars in Jamaica. And the image continues to be reproduced by historians in this context in the present day. This was the title image of a book that was about Jamaica 2 years ago. But in fact, the title, as the artistic similarities between this engraving and this original artwork by Augustino Brutus suggests, the original painting has nothing to do with Jamaica. The title of Brutus's original work, 1773 Treaty between the British and the Black Caribs in the island of Saint Vincent, is unambiguous. This is not an image of Jamaican Maroons, but of peace negotiations following the 1772 to 1773 Caravor in Saint Vincent. But by repurposing and retitling this image, the British West Indian historian Brian Edwards participated in this broader project of equating the story of the Kalinagos or Black Caribs, descendants of Indigenous and African people in Saint Vincent, with that of the much better known Maroons in Jamaica. And in a vivid illustration of the consequences of historical erasure, this equation persists. Even among historians, this is used in art historians, this is usually dealt with as an image of Jamaican Maroons, not as Vincentian Kalinagos. Tensions between Kalinagos and British settlers and officials would continue through the American Revolutionary era and after, culminating in a second war that began in March 1795 and continued until the exile to Belliso, with which I began this talk. And during this so-called Second Carib War, Kalinagos partnered with and received aid from French revolutionaries who had taken control of other Lesser Antilles islands like St. Lucia and Guadeloupe. This is the account of one of those French revolutionaries, a soldier named Belliso de Jeunesse, who lived and fought among the Kalinagos in northern Saint Vincent during this period. French troops and arms certainly came in handy during this war, but as I argue in my book, Kalinago combatants were not necessarily wedded to the French revolutionary cause. Instead, they welcomed the disruption of inter-island warfare as an opportunity to reassert claims to land. Although French forces surrendered in Saint Vincent to the British on June 10, 1796, Kalinago combatants continued to fight. Chief Chatoya had been killed in battle within the first week of the conflict back in March 1795, but more than a year later, on July 19, 1796, a group of Kalinagos confronted British troops at Chatoya's former stronghold of Pensab, which is in northeastern Martinique. As the British later reported, the Kalinagos declared that, quote, they never would submit to the English, and they did not revolt so much from the prospect of death as from the idea of submission. But as we saw with the exile from the beginning of this talk, submit they ultimately did. By the time that the Slavery Abolition Act was passed in British West Indies in 1833, the Chatoya's former stronghold had become a sugar estate of more than 1,400 acres, massive sugar estate. And living there were not Kalinagos, but enslaved people. British records, with which I'm currently working, I'm very happy to talk about in Q&A, show that just 20 years after Kalinago combatants surrendered to British forces, almost 700 individuals were enslaved on Pensab estate. And here we see some of the names of these men and women here, as well as their employment, the tasks that they most often performed, like laborer, tradesman, or midwife, their age, as well as their country or place of birth, either Africa or Creole, meaning born in the Americas. This ad comes from 1872, but it helps illustrate just how large and productive the Pensab estate became in the 80 years after Kalinago exiled. More than 1,400 acres, which is far more than the 500-acre maximum that individual purchasers were allowed to have in Saint Vincent in 17,000 when it became a colony. And it produces sugar, which Kalinagos had repeatedly resisted having grown on their lands. As I argue in my book, plans to dispossess Kalinagos and turn their lands into sugar plantations were set in motion decades before the Age of Revolution, as settlers and officials like Young advanced the notion that Afro-Indigenous people had no right in the soil of the country. By emphasizing the blackness of the so-called Black Caribs and claiming that their indigenous cultural practices were mere borrowings or were emulations rather than reflections of a hybrid culture rooted in Afro-Indigenous ancestry, settlers accomplished a rhetorical alienation with very real and very lasting consequences. As Young Jr. wrote in 1795, this is before British forces actually put in motion their plan to exile Kalinagos to Belliso, quote, either the British planters or the Black Caribs must be removed from off the island of Saint Vincent, end quote. So by diametrically opposing Afro-Indigenous land rights to the colonial settlement, Young offered an ultimatum. Either the Kalinagos had to go, or the British Empire had to forfeit a potentially lucrative sugar colony. The consequences of this ultimatum, I argue, illustrate a point made by the late anthropologist Neil Whitehead. Blackness originates in a political opposition to colonial designs. As in other parts of the Americas where dispossession opened new lands for plantation production, such as the 19th century southeastern United States, the twinned processes of racialization and dispossession facilitated the growth of sugar production in this part of the Caribbean. And here we see the ruins of a large watermill that was used for grinding cane at Alsace. And see the material remnants of this colonization. Yet, as the contested history of Kalinago, Carib, and Reefana survivance suggests, this is a history that is still being reconstructed, rewritten, and challenged by historians and by the descendants of people who were exiled and erased. As late as the late 19th and even early 20th centuries, residents of St. Vincent were surprised to discover Kalinago descendants still living in the mountains of the island's rugged windward coast, where their ancestors had taken refuge and had been exiled from decades earlier. This is a late, yes, an 1880 illustration of Captain George and his family. And George was described as Black Carib, and his wife, who goes unnamed, was described as Yellow Carib. Almost a century after their forebears had been exiled in the name of colonialism and sugar production, this Afro-Indigenous family continued to live on St. Vincent's windward coast. Their presence belies notions of Indigenous extermination and disappearance that continue to color many studies of the colonial and indeed the modern Caribbean. By refusing to accept that the Lesser Antilles Indigenous inhabitants simply vanished, and by instead interrogating the historical origins of Black Caribs, my work sheds new light on the lengthy and interconnected history of dispossession, slavery, and racialization in this region of the Caribbean, and invites comparisons with other parts of the colonial Americas. Thank you.
Well. Tessa, I think that you've given us a real tour de force of the 18th century and main highlights of the Kalinagos. And I would want to thank you very much for such a gripping presentation. You had us all through. I would like to open, I'm sure you would not be averse to taking questions.
No, I'd love to. Yeah. Will you filter and take this? Sure, yeah. So much for the presentation. I really enjoyed that.
Get some food before you go. Please.
Okay, I'll start us off. I have a few questions. Like generally, first is like you started us off with a particular island, right? First, you didn't like. Why were they exiled? Were they not needed for labor because there was so much labor being like brought in from West Africa? Okay, so it was more so get them off the land because they were resisting and bring in this new labor force that was going to create the sugar plantation. Okay. So I was like, my main question is like, this is intriguing in terms of the kind of things you are talking about. Very similar to like this image making, right? You need to create a certain, and it's perpetuated through rhetoric and visuals. And it's very similar to what happened here, like in the US, but very different in a sense where it wasn't indigeneity that was being used, but Blackness, right? So as a historian, like, what is that? Like, how does image making fall into actual factual history? Because for me, I read a few books and I'm like, much of history, mainstream history, does not pick up on this. It's just the story of what happened. But I think like what I'm trying to get at is like, much of what we read is false or it's crafted. And so as a historian, when you're digging through archives, like what is your process and like, what are you finding about history as a discipline, as an academic, or like as just like extra books, you know?
Yeah, thank you for those questions. That's, yeah, you've already given me a lot to think about. Yeah, so very briefly to your first question as to why exile these people. Yeah, basically, although people are really continuing to cast them as, oh, they're African, they're fugitives from slavery, they should be enslaved. There was a rumor circulating that in fact, like a descendant of a planter in Barbados was trying to lay claim to them as kind of supposed to have taken delivery of the original human cargo from the 17th century. So despite all these attempts to say these are African people and they should be rightfully reduced to slavery, the fact was there was no basis for that. Like I scoured the records to try and see, was there a shipwreck around this time? Now, not everything gets counted, but there doesn't seem to be kind of a factual basis for that, but that narrative of, oh, there was a shipwreck, it was going to an English colony, that gets more and more kind of circulated the more people want that land. So while many people would have, I think, preferred to simply enslave the 5,000 people who were living there, there wasn't a legal basis for doing so. And in fact, this question of what to do with the Black Caribs was catching some attention in England, where parliamentarians were kind of debating, well, are we being inhumane to Indigenous people if we do this? So they had, in British eyes, of course, they had to be removed in order to make room for sugar production. As to your second question about image making and kind of the role of rhetoric and visuals, that's something that I became really captivated by for precisely the reasons that you mentioned. Nobody was talking about Black Caribs until people, a specific group of people became very restive against the development of plantations. And then gradually those people became Black. And the way that they were represented visually became darker. And the way people spoke about them alluded much more to African origins. Though certainly, Saint Vincent had been a place of refuge for African or enslaved Caribbean people for a long time. You can, to go back to this kind of question, people could use these small vessels to go, you know, Saint Vincent is like 20 miles from Saint Lucia. You can take a canoe and people continue to take canoes and go between islands, right? So there's a maritime marinage where people were escaping to this island, and those who were trying to claim them for slavery were not able to recapture them. So for sure, it's a hybrid population, but I think their Blackness beginning in the 1770s is used to negate their indigeneity and to kind of say that in this system, there's no room to be both. When in fact, other documents suggest that people very clearly were both. And so it's documents like that baptismal record where it's, okay, this person had a Black parent and an Indigenous parent. One can assume that they would, or one can imagine that they would be exposed to multiple languages, exposed to different cultures. And so trying to interrogate those kind of, a lot of my work uses parish registers, because these brief mentions of, oh, this person came here from Saint Vincent in order to take part in this rite, or, oh, actually this person's who's appearing as white in the records, oh, actually their mother is being described as mixed race, right? So these little glimpses that allow you to kind of stitch together, this world is much more complex than, you know, the William Youngs of the world are trying to narrate.
So you had discussed the Garifuna and
Sorry?
the Garifuna.
Yeah.
And Belize, and these were those that were descendants of the Kalinagos. What efforts did you see to reassert this history of indigeneity within this, in their argument that this should be, that this property should, or this island should be bought by, we said by Belize or by?
They would like, so by the Vincentian government should like make it a heritage site
Oh, right,
for
heritage site, yeah.
Garifuna people. Like, yeah, ignoring this massive expense that this entails, right, where that then puts quite a burden on the Vincentian government. Yeah, so the place, Belliso is like a site of historical memory of trauma and loss. Like Garifuna people will host sometimes almost annual kind of pilgrimages to Belliso as a site to kind of mourn ancestors who were lost. And so there's an understanding there, like so I don't work on, I should say, I work on the Southern Caribbean. I don't actually follow the Kalinago into the diaspora as Garifuna people. But those who have, like, there's an anthropologist named Nancy Solian Gonzalez who wrote a very important book about the Garifuna, emphasize kind of this, the exile is a moment of kind of disconnect, but one through which Garifuna people continue to kind of have a sense of shared identity to which they cling within the diaspora. So Garifuna people are kind of enrolled as not mercenaries, but like they serve Spanish troops in Central America throughout the 19th century and remain like a recognized Afro-Indigenous group within Central America in the present day. So those twinned roots are certainly like very important to Garifuna people even now.
And then as a follow-up, so has there been any efforts on like the United Nations to recognize this as a cultural heritage site?
That I don't know. Like a UNESCO site?
Yeah.
I have to look into that, yeah. I think that is what the Garifuna want, that this not be sold as a private island and that it be recognized as a protected site. But yeah, to my knowledge, that's not like in process. Sure.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. So I have two questions. So the first question has to do with ideas of like survival and resistance. Because I remember you mentioned the Indigenous technology and how they were able to utilize these aspects of their culture to escape. And I'm interested in that idea because it combats this kind of erasure, you know, the presentation that they were all eliminated, they're all killed. And so I'm really interested in how else do you discuss ways of resisting and escaping genocide? I know you mentioned technology, and I think also with one of the images you talked about, if we look in the background, we would see like some persons escaping. So ideas of like Marunach or other ways of resistance, how do you engage that within your work? And so that's the first question. And then the second question I have has to do with kind of how do you connect your work that you're doing? So I know you're situating your work in a kind of historical context with the kind of 18th century, but how do you, and I'm hearing snippets of how you are touching on contemporary implications of historical experiences, but how more directly do you engage the contemporary concerns? Because we do still have these people who are living. And one of the things that's so important about the kinds of conversations we're having is how people tend to forget Even though we're learning about something in the 16th, 17th century, that is still affecting and impacting our present day reality. So how does your work engage with those kind of contemporary concerns? So those are my two questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so these questions of survival and resistance and other ways that people resist. Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think that canoes as an indigenous technology, we often forget, because I mean, versions of canoes are quite global, right? And I don't know if anyone has read Kevin Dawson's Undercurrents of Power, which is a recent book about African cultures of, aquatic cultures of the African diaspora. But basically and actually this comes back to his question about like, how do you, as a historian, kind of interrogate other things? He does this fantastic job of saying, actually the way that we approach water is really Eurocentric, right? We have these accounts from European settlers and sailors in the colonial era who often didn't know how to swim, right? Because they didn't want to survive if they fell off into the sea. They just wanted to drown. And like bathing was not well regarded by Europeans. And Dawson says like that has caused us to completely miss water as a space of survival, resistance, socialization. And that for me was really influential in thinking about, in the Caribbean, people talk about windward and leeward islands, right? In reference to, are the islands easily accessed if you're sailing, or are you beating against the wind? Indigenous people didn't use sails. They used dugout canoes that they could row. So if you're not sailing, this distinction is not that important to you. Like, yeah, if you're encountering a wild wind, you're gonna be rowing a lot harder. But this very distinction in how Europeans have carved up the Caribbean into windward and leeward, where Dominica geographically is a leeward island. I know it's confusing because it becomes part of the Windward Confederacy in the deep colonial era, but Dominica geographically is to leeward. When we look at how Indigenous people and those who use their technology engage this geography, that distinction doesn't matter, because if you get in a boat and you row it, you can get there, right? And so this division is not there. Okay, so technologies as resistance. Marinage is very important to the wider project because, in fact, the settlement of this space that I call the Creole Archipelago is facilitated by the fact that people want to move outside the sphere of colonial rule. They might be Indigenous, they might be Afro-Indigenous, they might be Black, they might be Black and white. They leave colonial societies because there is less space for them, because they're being enslaved and they want freedom from slavery, because they're a mixed race family and there's increasing laws limiting the possibilities for them throughout the 18th century. And so getting away and finding a place where they can continue to exercise autonomy is really at the kind of basis of this shared Creole society. So Marinage is, in all its forms, kind of underlies the whole project, because this is how this Creolized society that becomes such a thorn in the side of colonial officials comes into being, because people just remove themselves beyond the state. We think of islands as bounded spaces, right? They can be easily controlled, but in fact, every inlet is also a place of escape, right? And so if we think about islands as maritime borderlands, where people can very easily move between them and it becomes impossible to police because there's not one way in and out, there are many, then marinage and escape as a form of resistance becomes key to the survival of these different cultures and the new hybrid cultures that emerged. As far as contemporary concerns and how I engage with the contemporary, I mean, I think that making this history known is important. There's remarkable, so as you all know, right? The Caribbean is just underexplored as a region in general. We're never gonna have enough scholarship about the Caribbean because there's so much to say. But these, like an island like St. Lucia for Saint Vincent, there's very little history about them, to the point where when I tell people well, actually St. Vincent and St. Lucia weren't colonies until 1763, they're surprised by that. Like that's how little outside of the islands themselves, right? Of course, people within the islands often will have a strong sense of that history, often will have a complicated sense of that history where like in Dominica, people will tell me we used to be French. That's not actually true in terms of like colonization, but it is true in terms of the French influence in the language and the cuisine and the cultural practices, this French Creole kind of influence. So I think making the history known is important. I think that the project that I'm working on right now, which is a St. Lucia focus project at the moment, but I'm hoping to expand it out later, is one that takes those registries of enslaved people. I showed one really briefly for Saint Vincent, and we're digitizing and we're transcribing them, and we're trying to make them available to students and researchers, but also members of descendant communities, so that people can more easily both find their ancestors, but also understand the lives of their ancestors. The St. Lucian registries are super detailed. There's 9. Everybody has a first and last name, color, employment, familial ties, distinguishing physical characteristics, height. And so you can kind of get a clear sense of like multi-generational families. So that kind of making that knowledge available, I think, is one way that historians can kind of address more contemporary and speak to contemporary people and concerns.
I have another question. Okay. So you kind of talk about like how earlier on, like in the 1600s, there's more like the visuals, the rhetoric is more descriptive of the actual facts, right? But then you see like there's a shift. Is that like, I know you showed the charts, but I'm not sure. Is that like correlated with land grabs? Like, so the more land grabs increase, it's like the more we're seeing this false image made, like narrative kind of increase also. Like, what's that turning point between like more factual description versus like?
Yes, I argue that, yeah, it's directly tied to land grabs, and particularly if we look at this narrative, so of how did, like this shipwreck narrative. So this shipwreck allegedly occurred in 1765, right? When you look at historical, like people would care if there had been a shipwreck of a large, right, especially in the 17th century, if there had been 200 people bound for slavery and then that ship was lost, somebody would mention that because they would be invested in that. So there's no mention of it. And then in the late 17th century, you see Governor Steed, who was the governor of Barbados, allude to an earlier shipwreck. So he's like, oh, it's about 1635, which like, certainly not. And that's a moment at which Barbados is actually trying to claim Saint Vincent as a dependency, like they tried to create kind of a sub-colony, failed. And so this notion, and the British always say the ship was bound for Barbados. But when the French talk about this, again, they're trying to explain how is there an Afro-Indigenous population in Saint Vincent. I'm not denying that population is there. But when the French talk about it, they're like, yeah, there was a slave ship that wrecked. It was like maybe a Spanish ship. So the specificity is not there. Whereas for the English, the specificity is always there, but also it gets so specific the later you go in the 18th century, where it was 1675, it was going from Benin and it was going to Barbados, and there were X number of people and they landed at Bekia. Like, if this is true, why are these details only emerging at a point where that narrative and those details would become really useful for saying the people living there have no right to this land? Mm-hmm. So I do think that it's directly tied to an attempt that we can see in the writings of young senior versus young junior, as they realize that these people that they're taught, that they have characterized as like quiet and well disposed, are actually not going to allow them to establish sugar plantations on their land, then those people become cast as more and more threatening, polygynous. The treatment of women is like really harped on. And then also more African.
You know, your research speaks to like Pan-Africanism in a sense, because we talk about how African liberation is central to the liberation of all people, because this form of racialization is like how all kinds of like exploitation in terms of production are related to it. So it's very interesting, like, because your work kind of shows how that was a necessary impact, that Africa's darkness was necessary to justify these dispossessions. Okay, I mean, last question, feel free to ask, but you talk about war, right? Like you said first, there's a 7 Years' War, which this like the 1660 treaty is like given up, but like they make a new treaty where neutral lands don't exist. Where can you say the neutral lands, that kind of agreement was a sort of legitimacy of indigenous existence, because you're making agreements with that, right?
Yeah.
So I noticed what first thing war kind of was used to delegitimize any kind of treaties and actual like existence of indigenous people. You also talk about how war was used to like grab more land. So how do you kind of, in your work, like how do you look at war and the use of like imperial wars, right?
Yeah. It's fascinating because the 1660 treaty is archived in the French colonial archives. It's archived in the British colonial archives. Like, it's real. People signed it, right? We have the indigenous signatories. I think there were 17 of them, like making, they all have different marks that they make, right? They're not signing their names. They have like specific, signatures. And it's just completely disregarded. When the French and the British are hammering out, what are we going to do with these islands? The French person who's doing it, whose name I totally forget right now, but like the big French foreign affairs guy at this time, says, what right do the English, because the French have lost, right? So the English want everything. The English have conquered France's like prime Lesser Antillean colonies of Martinique and Guadeloupe, so the French want those back. And so they say, he says, what right do the English have to these islands? Did they not recognize by the 1660 treaty that these lands belonged to the indigenous inhabitants of the region? That's the only, I read all the, diplomatic correspondence. That is the only time that that's mentioned. Like, people were just ready to leave that in the past, and he's only invoking it because he doesn't want to give everything to the English, right? And then when the English say like, well, you can have St. Lucia, suddenly all bets are off, and there's no question of indigenous people. So I think the war, like the power of these imperial colonial powers in this period kind of erases. In the 1660s, they signed this treaty because indigenous people are raiding their settlements. Like, if they don't, the treaty says Kalinagos can have Saint Vincent and Dominica forever, and no one else will be allowed to inhabit these islands. They ask them, like, would you be okay with a French missionary coming in? And they say, that French missionary, yeah, like that guy is okay. But they won't allow anyone else to settle there. In exchange, they will stop launching attacks on the English Leeward Islands, on French colonies like Grenada. It's just getting which is a French colony in this period, is just getting ruined by these attacks. So they say, we'll back off if you recognize these two spaces. A century later, the settlement has increased, the firepower has increased, the manpower has increased, such that I think the indigenous or the Kalinagos assaults are not threatening enough that they get to be recognized as a sovereign people, even though that sovereignty is in the archive. It's very clear, and they just forget about
Anyone else have a question?
Let's see if anyone in the audience have a question.
I did put in the chat.
Yeah,
Nobody has responded.
okay. Go ahead.
We have two other questions. So I know you're forming or framing your project, your work in terms of focusing on displacement, dispossession, and racialization. I'm very interested to know how do you and if you also discuss ideas of like capitalism, particularly racial capitalism, and how do you engage that within your work? And the second question is, you also mentioned in terms of like future, thinking about the broadening of your work and your research. I know you're focusing specifically on Saint Vincent at the moment. Where else are you thinking to go? Why? What other connections are you pulling or thinking of?
Okay, so to your question, your first question about capitalism, for sure, there's as your question suggests, there's a massive and growing literature about the relationship between capitalism and slavery, right? To go back to Eric Williams. And that's something that certainly informs the work. It's not something that I am writing about at length in the book, but it's something that I think is at the heart of what's happening here, right? This dispossession is happening in the name of opening up lands for the production of sugar through the exploitation of people who are being commoditized and trafficked in order to enrich British planters back in England, right? So capitalism certainly is informing all of these contests, even back in the 18th century. As far as St. Lucia, yeah, so we started with the book, this Creole archipelago to which I refer, crosses imperial boundaries and crosses geographic borders to go from basically Guadeloupe all the way down to Tobago. So the book talks a little bit about Guadeloupe, but a lot about Dominica, Martinique, St. Lucia, Saint Vincent, Grenada, and also Tobago. So it kind of takes that area, which often is discussed in terms of the British West Indies or the French Caribbean, and says, you know, for people who lived there, those distinctions were perhaps, particularly in the 17th and 18th centuries, those distinctions were perhaps less important than the connections that they were able to forge across islands and the communities that end up straddling British colonial spaces, like Grenada becomes a British colonial space. But the people who live there are French-speaking Catholics, many of whom are people of mixed race, who are kind of appear for a time as white in the records and then re-racialized as Black, precisely for a land grab, and where they're told you actually can't own more than 10 acres of land because your grandmother was African. So the first project dealt with all of these islands as a group, and that's something that I hope to continue to kind of do, like do the Southern Caribbean as kind of a region rather than adhering to the boundaries that are created by imperialism. St. Lucia I picked because the registries so the British created these registries. They registered every person who was enslaved in the empire in the 1810s and 20s. Everybody, whether it was in the Indian Ocean, whether it was in Jamaica, all of the British colonies. But in recently acquired British crown colonies that didn't have colonial assemblies, the registries are more detailed. So for a colony like Jamaica, unfortunately, because there's a very powerful assembly dominated by planters, they're told you have to make this registry, but it's kind of left to them what the registry will look like. And so they literally just put by plantation by plantation, so you can get like numbers out of a demographic historians in the 1980s, like really exploited these resources as historical resources, but it will just give the first name, the color, and whether they work in the fields or the house, possibly African or Creole. That's useful demographically, but you can't, there's limits to what you can get there. In crown colonies where there aren't colonial assemblies, Parliament said, we want to know everything. Because they wanted to know, the slave trade has ended in 1807. What's the future of slavery? in the British West Indies. So if they can know, and there's issues around trafficking between islands. So if they can know, where exactly was everyone in St. Lucia born? So it doesn't just say African or Creole. It says, now for the African origins, they're guessing, right? But it says, Igbo, or it says Congo. But it also says Saint Vincent, it says Grenada, it says Martinique. So we see all of this movement of people between islands. Giving these familial relationships. There are 4 generational families living in St. Lucia in the early 19th century. This really is not what historians have understood about Caribbean slavery, which is often contrasted with slavery in the southern United States, right? Where it's a much more African population versus Creolized population. Anyway, all this is to say, I have been astonished at how much you can derive from the registries for crown colonies. And so the plan is, St. Lucia, we've actually got it fully transcribed now. So that's 16,000 individuals. And then the plan next is for Trinidad, where also a crown colony, not quite as detailed, but almost. So that's like the second most detailed. And then like Belize is somewhat detailed. So there, I think, as we make the next inroads, this is a collaborative project with someone in the high school, we're going to prioritize places where we need the most information. But I hope to write a second book about the experiences of people who were enslaved at the frontiers of the British Empire in an era that's usually associated with abolition. If you read about the British West Indies in the 1820s, with the exception of things about like 1820s and 30s, with the exception of things like the Baptist War and like the Demerara Rebellion, you're just reading about white people abolishing slavery from England, right? And you're not thinking about the fact that 700,000 people in the British West Indies were enslaved. They didn't know when this would be over. And so these registries give us some insight into what their lives were like, perhaps how they grappled with that. And so, yeah, St. Lucia, definitely Trinidad. And then, because I would like this to be a book, at some point I'm going to have to say, I'm just going to focus on these people, but center the experiences of enslaved people in the age of abolition.
Could you go back to the map so we can see the map again?
The map,
Just the map that shows the different islands and the
oh yeah,
colors.
for sure. So I can give you this one, or I can give you,
Yes, yeah,
This
that
one,
one,
yeah.
that one.
Yeah.
Yes. Because I wanted students to really reflect on the point that you made, that all of these territories or islands were one people, that those colors are meaningless for the people. Because right now, when people talk about Caribbean unity, they forget that this integration existed. And I think I want to thank you for a very fascinating presentation. And already you have 4 or 5 books that you're working on. But I think that we are going to take away so much from this in the Africa Initiative. And we hope that you'll take on some of our students as PhD students as you go on this work, because we have Caribbean students here who would be enriched by this work.
Yeah.
I have a number of questions. This Belliso that was being sold,
Mhm.
you said there was no water in it.
Yeah.
How do they get water there?
Yeah, so the British army, the British Navy, sorry, is there, right? Because they've been fighting the Napoleonic Wars.
Yes.
And so they had to bring barrels of, like, that was their job. If
Yeah.
it was said, oh yeah, we'll provide the exiles with everything that they need. So they're supposed to bring in like barrels and barrels of water.
Yeah.
I don't know if that happened, right? Like there's just this order that's given that food and water will be provided.
Yes.
But were some of these thousands of deaths the result of dehydration? I think it's entirely possible. Historians have tried to figure out what this malignant pestilential disease is, and typhoid is one that often, based on the description of the symptoms.
Yes.
So a lack of.
And who's selling the island now?
Like Private Island Paradise or
Who
something.
are
I
they?
think it's just, so I've actually seen it listed on a couple of like private island real estate companies, right? So I think they want, you know, a celebrity to buy it and make it the next.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want to comment on a few points that you've made. And I want to really thank you for the enrichment, because this has been a fountain of richness for us here in the Africa Initiative. And as Nadia said, that you have a lot to build on in terms of racial capitalism. But even before the British, you brought attention to de las Casas and how important de las Casas was. But I think it was important to bring out the debate between de las Casas and Sepulveda, and that major debate in the university about humanity and human beings, and how that defined the relationship. So the de las Casas Sepulveda debate would strengthen your argument about the dehumanization of the people. So it's not de las Casas, because for some places, de las Casas come out as a good person,
Right.
as opposed to Sepulveda. The other aspect that I think is so rich is the racialization project. And if we are talking about race as a social construct, about its importance in the project of colonization for the purposes of social control and control of human beings. Now, in this context, the Garifuna becomes important for the future liberation of the Caribbean and Latin America. Because if your project is linked to a liberation, for example, in Honduras, and this is where the Saint Vincent is linked up to Honduras, the World Bank has a specific project to use historians to cut them off from global Pan-African struggles. I don't know if you know that.
No.
Okay. The World Bank has a specific project in Honduras because of the land, the water, so that this historical work that you're doing will be very important for those people to connect their heritage to Saint Vincent. And in this sense, Saint Vincent acquires much more importance in the history of the Caribbean. I don't know if you know that there's a major international organization, or the Garifunas. In fact, there's a very big chapter in California, which is based on Saint Vincent. And I'm going to really suggest to the Prime Minister of Saint Vincent that he invites you down there, you know, so that you can give this talk to Saint Vincentian people. Because I think it's something that people of Saint Vincent should know. And the last point I want to reflect on is on the maritime marinage, which is linked to this map. And I think when people think of these islands, the fact that they're 20 miles apart, and the people still build the canoes, and how this is being manipulated by imperialism in the cocaine trade, and that how the people themselves could use this as a basis for protection of the islands. In other words, if we go forward in terms of what is possible in the islands, we see such great possibilities. So I want to commend you on this work, and we look forward to greater cooperation and collaboration between the African Initiative and our students and Caribbean students. And as I said, it is my intention. The Prime Minister is a very close friend of mine, of Saint Vincent, you know, and you'd find him a kindred spirit in terms of this kind of work. So thank you very much from the African Initiative.
Thank you so much for those comments, because I certainly was not familiar with the World Bank project, and that's something that I should really.
Thank you. We invite you all for some food, and please, you can,
Yeah, before, one last question. That's all right.
Oh, okay.
No, please.
All right. Thank you, Doc. Yes, thank you. I have a question and a comment. First is a comment on, I think an earlier presenter mentioned something on the history and how it connects to the present. And it was something that struck me because just recently in my class in Newhouse, we were looking at how history is told. And for instance, the Native Americans and how their story is still told as if it's what they call frozen in time, as if it passed and nothing connecting needs to the present. So it was interesting to hear that comment and how, as Prof is saying, for example, how people who still live today, they have this history and how we could connect that history to the present and see what that has contributed to the current residents of these places. That's more of a comment. I mean, but second, my question is on the research and what sorts of archival materials you follow. And I'm asking so because, again, I'm a communication student and I'm hoping that that the way story has often been told, that emphasis on hegemonic language, which is mostly English, and text, and a written text, as if that is like the standard for every research. I'm wondering if there are any other forms of materials that leave traces of the history of the people themselves that we can fall on in telling this story, just in case there are any that you came across. And I'm an African. A lot of our story often is our people have not written our history. And so, of course, and often because the text becomes there. So I just wanted to ask if there are, in your research, if there are any other forms of material, archival material that you engage with that could be useful to us in our research as well. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that comment on those questions. I think your point about Native American history being seen as like static and therefore easier to relegate to the past is a really important one, right? And this is where the connections with the present day Garifuna people who know where they're descended from and how they came to be there and tell through their oral histories and their acts of remembrance, like kind of give the lie to the notion that there is no continuing indigenous history in the Caribbean. To your point about looking beyond written text, yeah. So this is something where I think oral history could be really useful. That's not something that I do. And so, you know, in a better version of this project, oral history would be really important. But two sources that I found really useful were maps. And then also there's this it's a bilingual Indigenous French dictionary that was made by a Dominican missionary in the mid-17th century who lived with the Kalinago people in Dominica. And so those less orthodox sources are useful for two things. The maps, as I showed in the presentation, they can trace a history, right? Like, I think you were not here yet, but there's a map that shows, like, literally says, this is Massacre Fort. It's like, why would you call something that? And it's because a massacre took place there. But then we also see, like it notes here, the first windmill in the island was built in 1718. So we can trace, what does it mean when a windmill gets built? But even wilder with this map is you can cross-reference some of the names with Indigenous people. Rivière Pilote, in an earlier map, it says this is the Calvé of Capitaine Pilote. It's still called Rivière Pilote in the present day, but it's named after the Indigenous person who formerly controlled this territory. That's true for Le Robert too. So it's the names that French people are giving to Indigenous people, right? It's still a colonized document, but it allows us to think about Pointe la Rose is one too. Like these are all, if you collaborate them with written accounts, you learn, even though Indigenous people were supposed to be gone from Martinique by this time, in theory had been chased off the island, their names continue to speak to Indigenous presence. And then the dictionary is really cool because again, really informed by Kevin Dawson's call to like decolonize the way that you're looking at water and just kind of put things that we see as like non-colonized. I read that whole dictionary, but it's fascinating to think about what do people have words for in their language. And so there are all these words in the Kalinago language for water. There's a description of surfing. And the French people don't have a word for surfing, right? So it's this very lengthy entry where they're like, they take boards and then they put their bodies on the right. And so as you read it, you realize this is somebody encountering something that's very foreign to them, but that is an important and existing part of this culture. And that gives us a window into how people related to one another. So that is still a textual source, but in looking beyond just like colonial documents and thinking about, can we do an ethnography of a 17th century people, that became kind of a useful source for me.
Fountain of riches.
Thank you all for the questions. This is really fun.
Good luck with your work. Please hook you, John, for some food, some Caribbean food,
Yeah.
and people can engage with you individually. Please, thank you very much. Oh, Mahi have an announcement to make.
We do have an announcement to make about next week.
Yes?
We have